In our fifth instructional filming video, Austin's going over different camera settings like exposure, gain, shutter speed, ND, focus, to not only give you guys an idea of how they work, but also what they affect and when to use auto versus manual.
Light comes in different colors. For example, direct sunlight gives off a yellow color in the morning, a white color midday, and a blue color on a cloudy day. So you have to tell your camera what color light it's seeing so it can correctly adjust the colors in your video. You do this by setting the white balance. If your camera has the wrong white balance setting, your video is going to have a color tint to it, like this. Fortunately, you can fix a lot of this in editing. Most modern cameras are pretty good on auto white balance, but if you're filming for a quality TV show, you'll want to set it manually so it doesn't change in the middle of your video. Your camera has different settings for indoor and outdoor filming. A lot of cameras have presets like these that make it really easy for you. If you read your camera's manual, you can figure out how to set the exact color temperature. But for now, as long as you're close, it's good enough. Now let's look at exposure. Exposure is simply how bright or dark your video is. If the important parts of your video are too bright, they start to become white and we say it's overexposed. If the important parts are too dark, we say it's underexposed. You can fix exposure a little bit in editing, but you can only do so much before it breaks down your image. When a camera is in automatic mode, it adjusts your exposure for you. So depending whether you have to brighten or darken your image, you can either change the angle of the camera to the sky, move in or out of the shade, or add a camera light.
Well, we didn't really see much today and it's starting to rain, so we're going to come back tomorrow and try it again.
Another problem with automatic exposure is it's more susceptible to noisy or grainy footage. In low light, the camera tries to brighten the footage by boosting its electronic signal. This is called the gain, or ISO on some cameras. And when it's too dark for the camera to accurately brighten the image, you end up seeing the flaws as little speckles that we call noise or grain. You'll see this a lot at dusk and dawn. Some cameras can see better in low light than others, but they all have a limit. Also, if you're using a prosumer or professional camera, they have something called an ND filter, which you have to adjust by hand, even in automatic mode. But don't worry, ND filters are just sunglasses for your camera, so you'll only use them outdoors. DSLRs don't have ND filters, but you can buy external ones that screw onto the end of your lens. When you put your camera in manual mode, you have a lot more control of your exposure. You can use zebra lines or a waveform monitor to check your exposure levels. Then you can change your exposure by adjusting either the aperture, shutter speed, gain or ISO, or your ND filters. Alright, let's talk about focus. There's a lot of things you can fix in editing, and focus is not one of them. So it's really important to get it right. Most cameras have autofocus and manual focus. Autofocus works great when there's nothing between your camera lens and whatever you're trying to film. Older cameras would autofocus on the center of the image or whatever's taking up the majority of your image. But new cameras are coming out with better autofocus options like object tracking, face tracking, and touchscreen focus. And until recently, the autofocus system on DSLRs for video didn't work as good compared to the autofocus on an actual video camera. But even this is starting to change as technology advances. So you have to research the specific camera you're interested in. Using autofocus is fine in some situations, but even as a beginner, you have to know when to switch to manual focus. For example, if there are tree limbs between you and the deer, your camera is probably going to focus on the tree limbs, so you need to switch to manual focus. Focus is based off distance, so when you manually focus, you're simply adjusting the distance from your camera that things are in focus. The area around this focus distance where everything is clear is called the depth of field. You can have a shallow depth of field or a deep depth of field, depending how you set up your camera. Real quick, here's the same focus demonstration, but looking at it from the camera's perspective. As you manually set your focus distance from the tree to the deer, he starts to become clear. When you go past the buck, the farther tree becomes clear and everything else becomes blurry. One problem with cameras is it's hard to look at the viewfinder and fine-tune your focus. This often leads to slightly blurry footage, or soft focus as we call it. So to help out, cameras usually have a feature called peaking and a feature called magnification, or focus assist. Peaking uses a bright color to outline what's in focus. Whatever's the most in focus should have the most peaking lines around it. Magnification is when your camera digitally magnifies the image in your viewfinder so you can fine-tune your focus. But it's also confusing at first because you don't realize the image is only being magnified in the viewfinder and not on the actual video you're recording. Okay, so I'm purposely not going into detail on how to use your camera in manual mode because right now there's more important things and that gets complicated quick. Auto exposure is probably fine in most situations, but in automatic mode there's not much you can do. And the techniques I gave, like moving the camera and putting a person in the shade, obviously you can't tell a deer to do that, so if your camera guesses wrong, you have to know how to use manual settings. So another thing we talked about was the depth of field. And real quick, when your camera's on wide angle, in general you have a really deep depth of field. And then the more you zoom in, the shallower your depth of field becomes. So just something to pay attention to because your focus will get really finicky when you zoom in a lot and it's kind of confusing at first. All right, next we are getting in the woods and learning how to film your hunts and tell a story.